Welcome back to the Everyday Story podcast. We've got a really interesting story for you today to begin to understand how we read it well, learn from it, live well. Dr. Clem, thanks for joining us again today. I know this is one where we're going to lean heavy on your expertise and knowledge of the story, but how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. You sound better than you have in past days, so that's good. Looking forward to unpacking this story, and I think you have a pretty good handle on this, maybe even better than me. So let's have some fun with it and talk our way through it. So
Yeah, it's been a good 3 week lull in my life from trying to talk into anything that could record me. I've had all kinds of sinus, chest congestion problems. 'Tis the season, but we're really excited to get into this story today. So this is kind of the next chunk of the story, Genesis 12:10 through the end of the chapter /13:1, depending on kind of where you go. I think there'll be a little bit that we pull from 13:1, but this story, I'll kind of try to summarize it. Dr. Clem, feel free to cut in, interrupt what I'm missing, what I'm leaving out. But we'll try to do is just summarize the story, and then I've got some questions for you, Dr. Clem. So
okay.
We'll get ready to get some answers, kind of how we begin to understand this. But we open this text of the story. Remember, Abram and Sarai are journeying on towards Negeb. That's how I say it, right? Negeb. And that's where the story picks up. So they're traveling into the promised land, and then there's a famine in the land. Not a great start to where you're supposed to journey to, and then all of a sudden you don't have food. And that, just to stop, that's really different from the kinds of lives that we live, right? A famine where you can't Amazon something in, you can't go to Walmart, you can't mail something in from another continent. I mean, this is really unheard of in our day, in our lived experience in America for sure. But there's a famine in the land. And
Hey,
so,
wait a minute. Just before you go any further, Ben, it might be helpful for our listeners if, as you recount the story, pay attention to what we read in the first 9 verses, or what we studied regarding the 3 sort of key elements of the Abrahamic covenant, which are land, seed, and blessing. So as you recount that, like even now, 12:10, there was a famine in the land. So here's the promised land in a devastating or threatened, stressed condition. So anyway, just wanted to get that out there. So as you listen to the way the plot unfolds, give some thought to land, seed, and blessing.
no, it's great. So there's a famine, which obviously is a threat to life. It's a threat to seed. It's a threat to even, can we live in this land? What's going on here? And so they migrate immediately. So Abraham went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. So bad famine. You got to get out of there, got to get to a place that's got food. The first mention of Egypt, we'll get to this in a little bit, but Egypt is going to be a place where there's at least food. And so they go to Egypt. When they get there, as they're going there, Abraham kind of starts to catastrophize a little bit, starts to play through the scenarios, and starts to get pretty fearful in 11 through 13, and starts to say, hey, my wife's kind of pretty, and what's going to happen is if I tell them we're married, they're going to kill me and take you, and then what, right? Like the seed is gone, this promise is in threat, right? And so because of that, let's lie and say that you're my sister, and then they won't kill me, and we get out of here alive. And so that's what they do. They get into Egypt. Pharaoh's like, hey, she's pretty, and you're not married? Okay. He takes her, blesses Abram with all of these riches. But then there's kind of a confrontation, because the Lord kind of steps in, afflicts Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because he's taken Sarai, Abram's wife. Pharaoh confronts Abram on it and says, why don't you tell me that she was your wife? Why'd you say she was my sister? Here's your wife, take her and go. Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. And so then the text kind of ends with Abraham going back up from Egypt and settling in Negeb. And so It's a really interesting kind of story there. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot that's said and there's a lot that's not said, and we'll get into some
Right.
of that in a minute here. But I think, kind of zooming out, I think it's just good to affirm. I think oftentimes there can be kind of questions of like, did this actually happen? Like, is
Mm-hmm.
this normal? Like, is this actually historical? Or is this just kind of a nice story made up by Israelites to teach their kids some nice moral lessons? Kind of how would you answer that question, Dr. Clem, as far as like, are these real people? Are these real events? Are these real customs? Is this like normal in this time period? How do we begin to kind of think through the historicity piece of this story?
Yeah, no, great question, and it is one in Old Testament scholarship. The patriarchs are, a piece of the biblical puzzle or content that is and has been severely attacked. Try to undermine their existence, say that they're out of sync with the ancient Near Eastern culture and so forth. But there is enough evidence to say that this story, framed the way it is, represents a good bit of life in the ancient Near East. And we derive our information for this period from what we call the Mari letters. And Mari is located on the Euphrates River, and it bears witness to the cultural traditions that were associated with the patriarchs. And then there are the Nuzi tablets, and again some more cultural traditions that are more contemporaneous with the patriarchs. So the final one is the Code of Hammurabi, which maybe people would be familiar with, but it's a Babylonian law code that contains a lot of social and legal customs concerning or that occur in the patriarchal narratives. So when you look at these documents, uh, this literature that is somewhat contemporaneous with biblical material, you say, okay, well, life as we read it here in the biblical material isn't out of step with life as it did exist based upon this kind of material. So, like proper names, all the patriarchal names find their best equivalents in the early second millennium. The patriarchal names are abundantly exemplified among the Amorite population. Social and legal usages, very similar. Rights of children, how a man handles his wife, or there's really not an emphasis on divorce as much as keep the both wives without divorcing them. So things like that, geopolitical conflicts that we'll see coming up in Genesis chapter 14 are something that's documented in the extra biblical literature, and kind of the semi-settled lifestyle of the patriarchs is likewise very similar to. So yes, I think we can have confidence that Abraham was a real person who lived in this time frame. And then there's, in addition to attacking the patriarchs in this way, there's also challenge to the timeline. And we haven't made a big deal about this, but just briefly, what I would say, the way that I handle it is like trust the numbers that we read in the scriptures. And so I think that by comparing scripture with scripture and by taking note of maybe contemporaneous events in extra biblical literature, we can come up with a fairly good timeline. Just for the sake of dating, we're thinking, somewhere around 2166 is the time when Abraham is born. So you could take that age based upon the numbers that we find in the scriptures, compare it with extra biblical literature, and it takes us to the 1 Kings 6:1 date, the fourth year of Solomon, which we could date pretty reliably, to 966 BC. So it gives us a fairly conservative timeline. Sure, there's going to be variations, either up or down, but anyway, I think we have good reason to be confident in the transmission of the numbers, the dates that are given, and some patient sort of looking at everything, comparing where there's extra biblical information. We can have a reasonable timeline that leans into something that's conservative. So
They
anyway,
may
that
not
just
be
kept,
precise, but they're definitely
right,
accurate. That's what we would
right.
kind of say.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good way of saying it. So, is it 2166 or is it, a little bit later? Okay, we're still within the ballpark.
Yeah.
Overall.
Okay. Now, the second thing that I think pops up, and this is definitely how I was kind of taught this story growing up, and definitely a prevalent interpretation, is, like we said, there's a lot that's said in this story, and there's a lot that's not. And one of the things that's not said is whether the trip to Egypt is inherently bad.
Right.
And so some people will read going to Egypt equals the world, it's bad. They should have stayed, should have trusted. If they had trusted, God would have provided food for them miraculously, and they shouldn't have even gone in the first place. But that's all an argument from silence. It's an argument from something that's not said explicitly. What are your thoughts on the journey itself, right? We're going to get to the deception, going to get to the fear, going to get to all of that. But the decision to migrate in the first place, from the text, like from the story itself, we're not implicitly told they shouldn't have gone or they should have. Kind of how what are your thoughts on how we should read
That's a great question.
some of that
and
silence?
A lot of preaching has been born out of this question.
Preach is good.
Yeah, preach it. Here we're going to do some preaching. Yeah, I guess I'm just cautious about trying to be dogmatic about what Abraham is doing or not doing, because the narrative doesn't really speak to it. We learn, just as you had pointed out, there was a famine in the land, and it was pretty severe. So 12:10, identifies the famine and its severity. And what does Abraham do with his family? Well, we got to eat, we got to get some food. So let's go to Egypt, which is the breadbasket of the Eastern Mediterranean world. And there's no comment. In other words, there's no omniscient narrator. There's no, this is what the Lord says. And the only thing that we see, and you drew it out in your recounting, is in verse 17. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So you see the Lord acting as a protector. He's not withholding protection or disciplining, and so on. So I just want to be careful that we don't take this geographic place, Egypt, and say that every time we see Egypt, that it must be understood as the world. There are times when God says, don't go down into Egypt. In Genesis 26, Isaac, in that situation with Isaac, the famine, Abimelech, the king at the time, but there God says, don't go down to Egypt. But we don't have that here. We don't have that statement being made. But then, as we all know, the Joseph narrative, Joseph is taken to Egypt, and the Lord provides for Israel from the provisions of Egypt. So it's kind of like, in some ways, I like how you drew our attention to going down in the opening, coming back up in 13:1. And you're going to see sort of a similar sort of journey with Joseph. He's going to go down into Egypt. He's going to arise to a place of political prominence. The Lord's going to use that to provide for his people, and then he's going to get them out of there. So it's kind of, it's a good conversation. I'm just a little bit hesitant to impugn motive here at this particular point. Although, as we talked about, it does illustrate threat to the promises that were made in Genesis chapter 12. Land, seed, and blessing is threatened here right out of the gate. So after those promises are made, threats.
Yeah. Can we live in the land? No, we got to go somewhere else for food. And then the second piece, so in 11, right, Abram's feeling the pressure of like, I'm gonna be killed for my wife so they can marry her. And then we're really in a dark place, right? And so that fear, I think what's interesting is that fear and the subsequent deception that happens seems very clearly denounced in the text, right? Like the whole reason the plagues are brought upon Pharaoh's definitely not okay with that. They're sent out, kind of dismissed, escorted out of Egypt back to the land. Like all of those pieces definitely leads us to say the fear and subsequent deception that comes out of trying to avoid the result of the fear, right? So, how do we avoid not being killed? Well, we could trust that God will provide for us because he said he would. He said that we'll have a seed. He said that we'll have a land. He said we will be blessed. We could trust that and be honest, or we could just protect ourselves by not even acknowledging that we're married. Mm-hmm. And so that fear and deception is clearly kind of outlined and stands in stark contrast to the promises that were just made, right? I mean, you're like, hey, these are fresh in the narrative, right? Like in the line of narrative, it's like this is straight up. I mean, you're like, whoa. 9 verses earlier, we're just laying all this out. I mean, God's laying all of this out and saying, like, I'm going to provide all of this for you.
Right.
And then there's this, right as they're starting, it's like, is he? I don't know. And I think that's the point where we have to say, what does it look like to be a people of faith, to be the people of God, to trust these promises, to live out what it looks like? And I think this is where I certainly empathize a lot with this deception and fear, because I think the amount of fear that we all feel as people and the moves that we make to get out of fear, to get out of a place where we're vulnerable, to get out of a place where we're dependent on other people, the places where we can then protect ourselves and ensure a good outcome. It's like we're right there in the text with him, to be clear.
Right.
But I think that's the part
very
that's clearly
real.
Denounced.
Yeah.
I
mean, you can feel this in personal life and living. You can't help but feel it. But I think to your point, like, how do we judge what's going on here? And we typically, maybe it's a combination of things. Well, we say that what did Abraham do? He went down into the world. He's not trusting the Lord, so he goes to Egypt. But maybe where we get the more confident evidence that there's a lack of trust, perhaps, on the part of Abram, is this wife-sister arrangement or motif. And I mean, it amazingly, it is something documented in the ancient Near Eastern social traditions, where a man can refer to his wife as his sister. And so is he excused because he invoked a social custom that had some measure of recognition within the ancient Near Eastern world? But I think the purpose of it, or it, what does he want? He wants to deceive and he wants to protect. Now, I think even the way that Abram leads into it is like, you're pretty, I'm going to get killed. You'll have a life in the palace. I'll be buried. Kind of a thing seems to speak about self-preservation more so than protection of Sarah, or Sarai at this point. So again, to my opening point and to what you were saying is like, man, how often do we do things similar to this, where we self-preserve by deceiving, we self-preserve out of fear by taking advantage of, maybe a custom or a practice that was never meant to be deceptive, but can be used to be deceptive.
Yeah, and this is going to be a theme for God's people, like I said, through the rest of the Old Testament and definitely in our lives today. I mean, this is nothing new. This is nothing unique to Abraham. I think what's really interesting is when we look at what's to come in even the rest of Genesis, we're going to see some parallels to this story. So this won't be the only time that we will see somebody faced with threat. Abraham himself is going to repeat this situation similarly in Genesis 20. He's going to go to Abimelech, a king, and he's going to say that Sarah is his sister again. And there's going to be an interesting story there. And then in Genesis 26, Isaac is going to say that Rebekah, his wife, is his sister. And so there's going to be parallel accounts that we'll cover in subsequent episodes here. And we're going to see this repeating theme of, self-preservation. There's a threat to either Abraham or Isaac, and the tendency is going to be to deceive. Deceive to protect, deceive to remain alive.
Right. And I mean, there is an element of truth. I mean, I think we are aware, and I'm sure our audience is aware, that Abraham and Sarah were half sister. Half. They were, it was same father but different mothers. So there is some relationship there, but not so with Isaac and Rebekah. That would have been more of a cousin, marrying your cousin. Yeah. It's so interesting that you have the same situation in Genesis chapter 20, and Abram at this time doesn't seem to, he's still kind of living in that deception, fear sort of mindset, protect myself, protect our interest, etc. But in each situation, the Lord is blessing. The Lord is the one who's truly the protector and providing for Abram and Sarah, who will be the means that he'll use to bring forth the seed that would ultimately bless not only them but in the nation but the world.
It's interesting. So I think like the type of Egypt being the world. It's interesting here. You have like Pharaoh's words to Abram, and they're quite searing. Like the questions he asks makes Pharaoh seem more in line with a righteous. A righteous type of living than Abram, right? Like,
right.
It's like,
right.
Why didn't you just tell me? Like, come on.
Right.
Why'd you lie to me? All right, get out of here.
Yeah.
And there's almost like a type, like this is the first interaction with Egypt. And this is really kind of setting, you're kind of curious, like how much does this play into future interactions from the Egyptian side? Like, are the Egyptians remembering this interaction? Like, do they have that recorded down? And anytime someone's walking in from Israel, they're recalling, oh, yeah. Remember that time that we all got plagued? Remember that time where we all got kind of beat up by their God because we were lied to? Yeah, that's Israel. That's quote unquote God's people. Yeah, okay. There's kind of an interesting. You're kind of like, man, that's kind of a bad foot to get off on with the breadbasket that you should be kind to. But there's kind of an interesting dynamic there where Pharaoh is speaking more truth than Abram is, and yet in all of that, to your point, right? God is the one that saves them from this kind of tricky situation. Like there's not an easy way out. Like if Pharaoh marries, that gets complicated. If Abram comes forward, that gets tricky. Like there's no easy way out at this point. God saves them though, returns them back to the land with, and it's kind of implied here, all that he had is all of the stuff that Pharaoh gives them, like initially. Like so there's stuff that they're carrying back with them back to the land. And it's kind of a beautiful picture of like the seed is not actually under threat. The land is not actually under threat. God has all of the pieces to the promise. He will provide them. Like what was perceived as a threat actually wasn't a threat. And God is the one that is going to be faithful and show grace to his people. But any thoughts on?
Yeah, just one final thought, perhaps, that I was thinking about Abram and Sarah at this time as they're nomads, they're semi-settled, they're living in tents, they're traveling from place to place. So they're kind of like resident aliens. It's sort of interesting that in Genesis 14. Abram functions as a military leader. When Lot is in trouble, he is able to marshal an army together. So he seems to have, even though he's not perhaps a king with a kingdom, he's a resident alien who had some measure of respect, but not settled yet. And I wonder, I haven't teased this out or thought this through to some level of maturity in my thinking at this point, but just the idea of, we are, identified by Peter in his epistle, strangers, aliens, and perhaps maybe this is a good sort of analogy to think about. This is how Abraham functioned when he had meaningful life within, this ancient Near Eastern world, but yet he wasn't, He wasn't settled, in the truest sense of the word. He was looking for a different kingdom. And perhaps a good way to think of ourselves, we're resident aliens, moving from place to place at times, or, just moving from season to season more often. That is unsettling, and we're not really sure, what the next season will unfold. So I thought that might be helpful as well to tease that theme out, or that idea out, from this particular episode in the overall narrative of Genesis 12 to 25.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love it. So I think there's lots that's said and lots that's not. And if we're not careful, we can focus on what's not said and kind of go down a whole trail there. But I think, what does it look like to live consistently like God's promises are true? I think that's kind of the question maybe that I'm forced to kind of think through and answer is in my life today. Right. Like if Abram and Sarai had lived like everything that God had said was true, how would that have changed the fear they felt, the deception they felt like they had to pick, the subsequent acting out on all of that? I'm much more like them than I care to admit, and thinking through
me too,
all of the promises that we have, all of the realities that are true because of the gospel, and yet how many situations do I find myself saying, if I don't do this, then this person will do this or think this or treat me this way, or this will happen with money, or this will, and you kind of catastrophize and get all the way down to the end, and before you know it, you're in a situation not unlike Abraham's cornered in, like, oh, my wife's with Pharaoh right now, but he doesn't know that she's my wife. Now what do I do? I mean, those situations where you just end up thinking, like, if God says this and it's true, how would that actually change the way I make a choice? Change the way that I value, change the way that I live. And to be invited into that kind of consistency and that kind of security of like, God will keep his promises, God will deliver, God will provide, God will sustain. To be invited out of the kind of scarcity and fear mindset of gotta make sure, gotta protect, it's on me, I have to achieve. Like, we're invited out of that in the gospel and to a better way of living, that God is faithful and God will give grace. I think for me, that's kind of where my heart goes, to think through some of the ways that I'm just like that, to think through some of the opportunities to live consistently as if God's promises really are true, because they are.
And is he really in control of the situation? The promise, he's made the promise. Is it going to be, will God be faithful to the promise? And is God sovereign in this situation to protect the seed, to place me in the land, to bring blessing? And I think if nothing else, Abraham comes away with, man, God really blessed us in that situation and protected us ultimately from any catastrophe in a significant way. Let's go back to the land, and of course we see them doing that in 13:1. But, along the way here, as we've talked about narrative, how to read it well, this is just a good passage to illustrate that, we don't have all of the information. There are gaps. We call them narrative gaps. And we sort of fill in the gaps with conversation in community with one another, thinking it through and making sure that we're not making hasty conclusions, jumping to, maybe irrational sort of application. But this is how narrative works. And it's beautiful that it is community oriented. Hey, let's sit down and talk about this. What do you think? What do you think about this? So we're glad that you as our audience are taking advantage of that with us.
And next time we're going to talk about kind of the second threat to the land, but it's not going to come from an outside person. It's going to come from the family unit traveling in the land, and Lot's going to end up kind of being the next threat to the promised land and how Abram's going to settle in it. And so we're going to get into that in the next section. Again, it's interesting kind of how there's these threats kind of stacked up together. And this is the first one. We'll talk about the next one after that, and then the final one kind of after that. But it's all just so interesting to actually walk through all of these pieces and see how they all kind of link together. So, Dr. Clem, thank you so much for bringing all of what you brought to the table. Really grateful to talk through this, and excited to talk with you all next time about the next section.
Always good. All right. Blessings.